Why are the protests in Thailand different from years past? Earlier this month, the Thai government tried to ban demonstrations that have been raging since the summer by enforcing an emergency decree on public gatherings. But spoiler alert, instead of quelling anger, it had the opposite effect, so much so that the authorities had to backtrack.
Thailand rolled back their emergency decree on Thursday that aimed to shut down months of protests against the government and the monarchy. When the government issued the ban that took effect 1 week ago, it in fact inflamed demonstrators even more.
Thailand has a long history of political unrest, with the last decade and a half being especially volatile. But the current protests are different. Thousands of students are demanding democratic reforms, specifically to reduce the powers of King Maha Vajiralongkorn.
The young Crown Prince Vajiralongkorn was first introduced to the Thai people through his father's home videos, which were shown in cinemas across the country.
One of King Vajiralongkorn's first acts after taking the throne was to turn the monarchy's $70 billion fortune into his own personal bank account. That made him richer than the Saudi king, the Sultan of Brunei, and the British royal family combined. It didn't take long for the king's spending habits and behavior to offend many in the country.
He married his bodyguard, dubbed his poodle an air chief marshal, and cycles around Europe in next to nothing. Thai King Vajiralongkorn's behaviour has raised eyebrows since he was a little kid. But lucky for him, it's illegal to criticise the royal family in Thailand.
But it's also exactly why these protests are extraordinary, because past protests never dared to touch the monarchy. The Thai constitution says the king is enthroned in a position of revered worship. And Thailand has some of the strictest lèse-majesté laws in the world, with sentences of up to 15 years in prison.
Critics say that the military-backed government has used this law to stifle dissent and clamp down on free speech since then. They also say that there is no clear definition of what constitutes an insult to the monarchy. Trials are often held behind closed doors in military courts, where defendants' rights are limited.
Under the late king Bhumibol Adulyadej, who rarely courted controversy and was universally loved by Thais, most accepted the strict laws. But now, protesters have been emboldened and are going after politicians who stand in their way. Their current target, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha.
Once again calling for Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha to resign. The protesters vowed to remain until their demands were met.
Prayut Chan-o-cha came to power in a 2014 military coup. Last year, he switched his junta title with Prime Minister. His government has suspended much of the city's public transport system and cordoned off areas where protesters might gather. He's also cracked down on the Telegram messaging app to break up their ability to organize. So how did we get here? For decades, Thai society has been polarized along class and regional lines. The rural poor versus the urban military-connected elite. And that came to a boil when the red shirts clashed with yellow shirt protesters, crippling Thailand for years. But today, the political cleavages have drawn in a new front, a tech-savvy young generation that is demanding change. And they aren't scared to target the most sacred institution in Thailand.
Here we see the King and the Queen being driven by motorcade through the protesters, and this was what greeted them.
Protesters are using a three-finger salute as their rallying cry. It's become their unofficial symbol of defiance. You might remember it from... So what makes these protests different? The difference now is the monarchy is losing its invulnerable status, and with an unpopular king on the throne, protests are gaining steam. What's their demands? Checks and balances on the government, military, and king.